Alrighty, I think we are going to go ahead and get started. So thanks everyone for attending our Zoom webinar. This is At What Cost, a community information session on the hazards of Chapel Hill's coal ash. My name is Amelia, and I'm a field organizer with Climate Action NC, a project of the League of Conservation Voters. So, a few notes before we start. First, this event is co-hosted by the Blue Ridge Environmental Defense League, also known as BREDL, Climate Action NC, the Friends of Bolin Creek, the Chapel Hill Organization for Clean Energy, also known as CHOCE, and the Alliance of Carolinians Together, or ACT, Against Coal Ash. As you all know, we've moved this event from a hybrid event to a virtual community information session. Unfortunately, one of our speakers was unable to join tonight due to illness, so we're slightly changing up the agenda to accommodate that. After every speaker tonight, you all will have a chance to ask a few questions. We will also hold a part 2 of this meeting in the near future to provide you with a chance to ask any additional questions, and also host a full discussion on public comments, why they're so important, and how to form an effective public comment. And we, of course, value the strong public support for this forum. And so we'll run either a poll here on Zoom or in a follow-up email to get feedback on the best time to schedule a part 2 of this event. And as a disclaimer, we are not representing the town of Chapel Hill. If you'd like to hear more from the town, you can contact your council member or visit www.futureof828.org. But tonight we are here gathering and speaking as concerned community members with the intention to educate our community and provide a forum to speak on the unprecedented proposal to build housing on top of coal ash in Chapel Hill. So another note, you can always drop things in the chat. Feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. We will also be dropping links to the agenda and resource lists in the chat. But yeah, to start us off, we're going to hear from Nick Torrey, a senior attorney at the Southern Environmental Law Center who grew up in Chapel Hill and has worked on coal ash pollution since 2011.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. I'm going to attempt to share my screen. So give me one moment here. So can you all see the SELC logo? Great. Okay. Thank you. Sorry about that. I'm, believe it or not, something of a novice at this after all these many months. So I'm Nick Torrey with the Southern Environmental Law Center. We have represented Friends of Bolin Creek, local conservation group here in Chapel Hill, since 2013 in advocating for a safe solution to the coal ash contamination at this site at the police department on Martin Luther King Boulevard. This property was what is called a borrow pit. So it was a privately owned piece of property. It was dug out in the 1950s to use the dirt elsewhere. And then in the 1960s and 70s, tens of thousands of tons of coal ash, along with construction debris, were dumped into the pit over those decades. And then it was covered over with a layer of soil. And that area is about 4.5 acres of the 10-acre property. WRAL News has reported that state officials say this coal ash came from the UNC power plant. And so there it sat, and the town acquired the property in 1980 and built the police department building on the upland portion of the site in the early 1980s. And then nothing happened with the site until 2013, when the town, I believe, was looking into moving the police department and began to do more investigating of this coal ash situation and notified the state and the public of the coal ash and began conducting sampling and producing reports with several environmental consultants. Based on those reports and studies that the town's consultants have done, we know that this site is contaminated with the toxic metals and other pollutants that are found in coal ash, such as arsenic, at levels that are far above the naturally occurring levels in the soil and the groundwater at this location. There's also coal ash actually exposed on the surface, sitting on the ground right now, and you'll hear more about that later. Coal ash has very fine particles, so it can be inhaled deeply into the lungs more easily than other kinds of contamination. It makes one thing that makes this site different from other kinds of contaminated sites that have the same kinds of metals there. Coal ash is a little different. There's a steep slope of coal ash just above the public greenway at Bolin Creek that is eroding, and I'll show you where this all is. So the police department building is visible in the top portion of this image. The red is where approximately, the area where the coal ash is. And you can see the green line, that's sort of the rough path of the public greenway. And the blue line is Bolin Creek. And if you can see the narrow white lines, those are topographic contours, and you can see that they're very close together in the southern portion of the ash. That's a very steep slope, and that's where the ash has eroded down to the public greenway and continues to erode. The floodplain of Bolin Creek, importantly, runs all the way up north of the public greenway to the base of that steep slope. And we saw that during Hurricane Florence. It flooded all the way up there. So what is the town proposing to do about this coal ash situation? This is what I've been asked to speak about tonight. What is the town proposing? So this is a sketch that they've presented. This was part of a non-binding agreement that they have signed with a private developer. And this sort of is a rough outline of what they're thinking. I'm going to show you another image shortly that's a little clearer to understand. But this was the first one they put forward. And the basic concept is that they want to leave most of the coal ash on site. They want to construct buildings and community green spaces on top of the ash. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that. I should say, this plan is not set in stone. It, in theory, can change. But this is what the town is currently moving forward with pursuing, and it includes housing, as I'll discuss. So it can change. We hope it will change, but it's not changing right now. And so I want to address what the concerns are about this approach. The next slide I'm going to show was presented by the town's private law firm that they've hired. And it mentions, it says draft, but this was publicly presented. The important point here is that they plan to remove some amount of ash, but leave most of it and cover what remains with a layer of dirt. This says 3 to 4 feet. That hasn't been determined, but some layer of dirt covering up the ash. Build a retaining wall along that steep slope in the southern portion of the site. And that's what they call a cap that they hope will contain the pollution and coal ash. Now this, just as a reminder, this is where the ash is, and now I'm going to show you a better drawing that was presented to some of the boards and commissions in town of what the proposal would look like. I think this is clearer to understand. As you can see, it's really sitting on top of where the ash is. And what you're seeing here is in the turquoise color is where the town would build new town office space. They would have a parking garage, but then surrounding that in blue, they would build, it says approximately 175 to 250 apartments. And as you can see, there are, throughout this property, there are green spaces that would be open to the public and to the residents on top of the coal ash. Those are the areas that we're concerned about just using a dirt cover. Before I go, oh, and let me say too, they have, as part of this plan, they have been clear that the idea is that it may include some amount of below market rate or affordable housing units as part of the housing that would be built on this site. So that's why I wanted to get to this slide and just be very clear. Southern Environmental Law Center strongly supports affordable housing. This site is also on a mass transit corridor. We strongly support housing on a mass transit corridor. But we need solutions that keep people and the environment safe. And unfortunately, the current proposal, as it's been sketched out and presented to the public, has very serious problems and concerns that that need to be addressed and are totally insufficient right now. So what are those concerns? Let me start with this. The problem that we've seen over and over again at different coal ash sites throughout the Southeast and elsewhere is that covering coal ash up with dirt over and over again has not worked to prevent exposure. So in Mooresville, North Carolina, they have had repeated instances of coal ash getting exposed. There are a lot of coal ash fill sites, as they call it, where the coal ash was buried near these residential areas around Lake Norman. And the ash has gotten exposed repeatedly. This story is from 2018, when they had one incident where this was sort of discovered when it got exposed. 2 years later, it happened again. They had a large sinkhole open up and expose more coal ash in the same general area. The examples just go on. So here's another one at a playground in Tennessee, where this year they confirmed findings from a Duke University study that buried coal ash at this playground, which was actually even covered with a synthetic barrier as well as a layer of dirt, and gotten exposed at the playground site in Tennessee. Another way in which coal ash can get exposed when it's buried, like what the town is proposing here, is through a structural failure, sort of like the sinkhole that I mentioned earlier. So this is a blurry image. The next one will be clearer, of a site in Wisconsin at a power plant where coal ash was buried and actually capped with pavement and buildings, like what the town is proposing. And it actually spontaneously collapsed. So I'll show you that as it collapsed down the steep slope one day. This was not during a storm event or anything, this just happened. So coal ash is an unstable material and can behave in unpredictable ways, as we saw in this incident in Wisconsin. So those are some of the concerns about the dirt cover, and in particular, you know, if coal ash is exposed, there are several problems with that. It contains, as I mentioned, toxic metals, and you'll, I think, be hearing more about those details. But you know, down along the public greenway right now, sorry, I'll say one thing and then go back to that image I just showed you. The town has a warning sign saying contact with coal ash may present health risks. And so, you know, that's one indication of the problem. Here's the sign. Another is, as I mentioned at the beginning, the inhalation concern, and public health experts that we've spoken to have raised that and pointed to scientific literature that is very clear that that's a major concern with coal ash. And so if it's exposed to the air, people can breathe it in. At this site right now, where coal ash is exposed, they have done a risk analysis, and even using what is not the most protective standard, they found unacceptable risks even from short-term exposure, as well as unacceptable risks to residents. So if that ash is covered up but then gets re-exposed, you know, those risks are still there. That's the concern. Now, the last thing I meant to say that I forgot earlier is this site itself, the Chapel Hill coal ash site, is an example already of a failed, a site that where a dirt cover has failed to prevent exposure of the ash, because that's what happened. The ash was covered with dirt, and in some areas of the site, it's still covered with more than 2 feet of soil. Those are the areas shown in blue on this drawing, but the areas shown in yellow and purple are where the ash is either completely exposed due to erosion and other factors over time, or where it's covered with only a very thin layer of soil. And then the green areas are where it actually eroded and slid down onto both sides of the Bolin Creek Trail. And the town has since removed 1,000 tons of that ash, but all the rest of it remains. And the point is that, this site is in itself an example of how that type of dirt cover just has not worked. So, those are shortcomings that we just don't see the town's current proposal addressing at all. Housing in particular is a concern at the site because it carries more risks than other kinds of uses. There are more vulnerable populations living there, on the site, as opposed to office workers or something. You have children, pregnant women, the elderly, for example. This site may have a deed restriction on it that says you're not allowed to dig, but kids and pets don't read deed restrictions, and they do play in the dirt. And this site will have those green spaces, and people will be outside, and things will happen over time. And the concern is, you need to have a more protective approach. We're not aware of any successful examples of housing being built on top of a coal ash site like this, anywhere in the United States of America. There's an additional concern as well, which is environmental justice. And in particular, the concern that's been raised, frequently when this comes up, is housing for lower income families, would potentially put those with the least resources at risk from this type of approach. And so, for example, the university newspaper's editorial board published an editorial this spring in which they were very strongly opposed to this plan for that reason. So that's an overview of what the concerns are, what the town is proposing to do, and what the concerns are about it. And I will stop there for now. And I don't know if we want to do questions now or move on to the next speaker, but thank you all for being here.
Yeah, thank you, Nick, for sharing all that information. I think we already got a few questions in the chat if you or someone else can answer them. Let's see, it seems first the question was, has Bolin Creek been sampled below the disposal site and under different weather conditions? So, for example, after rain events.
So they have done sampling on several occasions over a period of years. So maybe 2 or 3 samples at different times. And they have not found, fortunately, they have not found significant impacts on Bolin Creek. So they have, one round of sampling, as I recall, had slightly elevated levels of manganese in the sediments of Bolin Creek downstream from the site as compared to upstream. But in general, they have not found, when they've done that sampling, they've not found measurable levels of coal ash pollutants being elevated in the creek or its sediments as a result of this site. And that's a very good thing. And that's one of the reasons why we at SELC have not advocated at this site for digging the whole thing up. This is not a site where the ash appears to be sitting in the groundwater, and it does not appear to be causing major impacts to Bolin Creek. We do think that any plan that leaves ash in place needs to have, among other substantive protections, it definitely needs to have also continued sampling and monitoring of the creek and the groundwater and the soil to catch problems if they do get worse, because that can happen over time. So as of now, that's the situation. But I do want to be clear that this is not the kind of coal ash site that we've seen elsewhere where it's causing major off-site impacts. It is causing significant impacts on the site, and that's the concern that I'm speaking to now.
Yeah, and it sees there's another question from Jane. Is this a plan for replacing the police station? How much coal ash is present at the site at this time? And I think you've already touched on this a bit, but has water quality testing, but specifically of groundwater, I guess, been conducted and published anywhere?
Right. So yes, they've done the groundwater sampling. There's a lot of that. It's in a whole series of reports on the town's website. If you go to the town website let's see, I can't remember exactly what their little tab is, but if you search for the Chapel Hill Coal Ash site or go to that Future of 828 site that Amelia mentioned at the beginning, it will link you to the whole list of reports that document that. But what we found is that yes, they've got levels of coal ash pollutants that are, as I said, significantly above the background levels in the groundwater. So it's contaminated groundwater and it's contaminated soil and it's actual coal ash sitting there. As far as the amount, they originally estimated about 60,000 cubic yards, which is very approximately 60,000 tons. They then, in a subsequent study, said they thought it was significantly less than that, but they never came up with another number. So I would say that it's fair to say tens of thousands of tons based on that. And then finally, yes, this plan, I believe, would include the offices for the police department in that turquoise municipal services center building that would also, I guess, hold other town offices as well.
And I think the next question is from Maria. I'm really tired of hearing about affordable housing without any details. Do they mean mobile home, condominiums, small single-family homes? If this is going to be below market value, where will the subsidy come from? And will there be taxes, or will taxes rise to fund this housing?
So some of those, I think, are questions best addressed to the town council. As far as what kind of housing it would be apartments. So I can speak to that.
I think there might be time for maybe one more before we go to the next speaker. So this is from Nancy. Who is the town saying would pay for coal ash removal, taxpayers or the market rate developer? And how much is the town planning to sell the land? Also, you might not know from the top of your head, planning to sell the land to the market rate developer.
So the plan that they've got right now, and I wanted to specifically, address the pollution and the coal ash concerns first and foremost. So I apologize for not getting into more of this. But they would basically they'd be sort of splitting the ownership of this 10-acre property where the private developer would have some of it. And they did say that they would sell it to them at something resembling a market rate when we asked them that question. But what that number would be, who knows? As far as who would pay for various aspects of this, to my knowledge, the town would pay, and as far as what effect that would have on taxes or anything else, I couldn't speak to it. But they have in that memorandum of understanding, that is the non-binding agreement that they've signed with their private developer, they do sort of sketch out what some of those terms might look like. This fall, they plan to sign a binding agreement with that developer. And so that's part of why it's so important right now that people, are involved in this and make their concerns heard, because I think the key decisions are being made, going into the fall, and then they'll seek approval from the state, and the state may impose additional conditions or not on their plan, and we would see an agreement with the state this winter or early spring.
Great. Well, I know there's a lot of additional questions, and hopefully we can get to them later. But next, we are hearing from Adam Searing, a first-term Chapel Hill Town Council member. He's also a public interest lawyer and health advocate who has worked to expand health coverage and improve care for millions of North Carolinians and folks nationally.
Hey, thanks, Nick and Amelia, and thanks to the organizers for having this public forum where we can really have the people ask lots of questions and have answers and really talk about this really very, very important topic. So I want to, just welcome folks here and say two things to start out with in my remarks. So the first is that I am on the Chapel Hill Town Council. I am the only council member who voted against proceeding with building this plan to build housing on the coal ash and garbage dump that we own. And I will continue to vote against that until we clean it up completely. And that leads me to my second point that I want to make, which is at the start, which is that I fully support building some sort of housing on this site as long as we completely remove the coal ash and other toxic waste that's there. I think, you know, eventually we can do something like that, but not now. So let me just give you, I'm going to give you a very short background of why I came to this decision as a newly elected member, which was not the easiest one to make, and then show you a few photos of the site, which I've taken in my capacity as going out there and, you know, representing everyone and trying to figure out what the heck's going on. So Amelia was saying, my professional day job is that I'm a attorney and public health professional. I've been advocating for better health care for children and families for over 30 years. I'm a researcher now. For many years, I was an advocate. I helped start North Carolina's first children's advocacy coalition. I've worked on everything from, you know, writing about solutions to reduce maternal mortality to how states can pass Medicaid expansion. I've worked on, you know, the multiple laws like the graduated driver's license law in North Carolina or establishing the children's health insurance program. So I have a passion for children's health and children's well-being and our families. And I bring that to everything I do, of course, and especially as an elected official. And when I heard about this plan to build on this coal ash site, I was, you know, sort of a few alarm bells went off, but I started to learn a lot more about it. I was getting briefed by the staff and I was a little worried, but I wasn't that concerned. The police station had been on that site for many years. But then I started to get very concerned and over the last few months. And the first thing that triggered that was that I learned that our plan was going to go ahead and build housing for children and families on that site. And as someone in public health and as an advocate for kids, I can, you know, just cite off the top of my head these sites around the country where towns have done exactly what we're proposing to do, build housing on top of old toxic waste dumps, and 20, 30 years later have health problems for the families that live there. I also went to a day-long symposium at Duke University that was held this year, that along with Carolyn here, as you're going to hear from, and heard about the research and what was happening in the latest we know about these coal ash sites. And very, very troubling, I have to say, especially the newest federally funded research about health effects on children, mental health problems, behavioral health problems, depression. I mean, this is all from inhaling the coal ash and the metals that are inside it, just the very least. Since then, I've met parents from around North Carolina who live in places like Mooresville, where Nick Torrey was showing you some of the exposed coal ash, where their kids have had thyroid cancers, multiple kids, teenagers with thyroid cancers, cancers of the eye, where melanoma occurs on the eye and you have to remove the eye. I mean, just terrible, terrible things. We just setting off all kinds of alarm bells. And so I was worried as a representative, and I've been out to the site. I don't live that far away from it. And I want to show you all some of what I found, just a few photos of what it looks like out there. And let me tell you, it's got mounds of coal ash spilling out of it, but it's also a garbage dump. The folks who filled up that pit in the 50s and 60s filled it up with a lot of trash and a lot of construction debris. So let's take a look. I'm just going to share my screen right now. Okay, hold on. All right, are we good? So this is a picture of the site. It has on the left is the photo in March that I took. That's just coal ash spilling out of the site. I think that was in some of the media stories. In May, the town employees went and covered it up with landscape cloth. That doesn't do anything, by the way, to help contain the toxic elements here, but it makes it look better if you're taking pictures. So it's like, it's, you know, nothing more than covering it up. The second thing you do, if you look closely, if you're back there in that site covered by brush and trees, you find a lot of trash back there. And if you look at the trash, like this Canada Dry bottle I found, it's you can date it. That's a nice thing about these bottles. So you look on eBay, it's from the 1950s. So this is a lot of old trash. So there's also a lot of rotting garbage bags at the thing on the left, the picture on the left, you can really see here, you've got, that's very typical. There's multiple garbage bags just kind of subsumed into the soil and rotting, and who knows what was in there, and other trash. And on the right, there's just old building materials that are stuck back there. It's from the, you know, when they were trying to fill up the site so it could be built on in the 50s and 60s. And what do we have in the 60s in building materials? Asbestos, lead. The building materials are just spilling out of the site. I mean, this is not some, you know, structurally sound, amazing place that you want to build some big development on. This is what it looks like. You have to go back and see it, but this is what it is. It's just pouring out the hillside. And then the worst thing, what we're talking about tonight, just poured over all this stuff, are just mounds of the coal ash. So it's just exposed ash. That is behind all that green stuff, is just exposed ash that's poured over all this trash that I just showed you, and just coming out of the site. That stuff is drying up right now, and kids who live near there, including my kids who grew up around here, are can breathe that in when it's up. So this is just something we really need to deal with. It is just simply outrageous, and we need to take some action here. And that's why I voted against moving forward in this plan. I'm for building housing on here, but we have to clean it up first. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to answer questions, and I'll stop sharing my screen.
Great. So I'm trying to identify if there's any specific questions that you can answer, but first, just to get followed up in the chat, I think the last unanswered question was from Maria. Are there any known methods to neutralize coal ashes in situ?
Yeah, I think Nick or Carolyn may be more able to respond to that. I think there are. I've been told that there are, but I think it's also complicated by the other stuff that's dumped in the site. But I don't know if they have a better response than I do.
Hey, this is Nick Torrey. I would say, to my knowledge, the answer to that would be no, in the sense that if you're talking about sort of when you say neutralizing, I mean, coal ash, the pollutants in coal ash are can leach out if it's exposed to water or the elements. So, you know, if it's fully enclosed in a lined situation where it's dry and separated from the rest of the environment by a synthetic barrier, as at an industrial solid waste landfill, for example, that's sort of the current best available state-of-the-art way to clean up the ash. That this site is unlined, does not have that kind of a synthetic barrier. So that's in large part, that is the concern.
Another question that Adam might have some insight into is, has a structural engineer ever been hired to determine how much and where the coal ash is?
Yeah, and I think I don't want to keep passing stuff off to Nick, but yes, they've hired, I'm not sure it's a structural engineer, but some of these consultants, I mean, goodness gracious, we pay enough money to consultants, but your tax money, by the way, but they have looked at this, and my understanding is that they would have to drill down through all this dump down to the bedrock. Is that right, Nick, in order to try and stabilize things, so it would disturb all this stuff.
Right. So there's sort of two issues in terms of figuring out where the ash is. They have done extensive drilling or borings, as they're called, as part of these reports, and they have found where there's more and less ash and other materials. And that's where those maps that I showed, that's sort of how they were put together. And then there's the issue of a structural engineer who might be called upon to figure out how to deal with stability if you're going to build something on the site. And that's something that, to my knowledge, has not been done yet, but would clearly need to be done for any kind of redevelopment project on this site for all the reasons that Adam has mentioned.
And I was just seeing there was someone asking about what compelled other town council members to vote in favor of this project. Is that okay to?
Yeah, I think we can hop, if there's any additional questions that are left over at the end, we can always ask them if there's extra time. So I think it's okay to hop around a bit.
Okay, well, I just noticed that because I think that's an important question. I mean, these are all important questions, but this is a particularly important one. Why am I the only one saying we shouldn't do this? Aside from, I have a professional interests in public health that I advocate for children for so long. Well, I think there's two reasons. One is the questioner is absolutely right. I do think the cost is a factor. Like, that people worry that if we start digging into this trash dump, that it'll cost a lot to move. And I back to that, but I don't think the answer is then to say, well, if we build on it and get this private developer involved, that this can help us cover, selling some of this can help us cover the cost in this way. I think what our first responsibility is the health and safety of our residents and families. And if that means that we spend more money to clean this place up and then have to sell part of the property, then so be it. But that should be, the primary goal. I think the other thing that is compelling people is an honorable reason, is that we have a very serious housing problem and crisis, like many places in the country do. We have the same thing here in Chapel Hill. We really need places to live. This is a great place to put some housing. It's right on the bus line, and it's a good place for if it was clean and it was cleaned up, it'd be a good place for people to live. But right now it's not. So I think those are the reasons that are happening, at least in my view. I can't speak for anyone else.
Caroline, are you raising your hand to speak?
I am. Just to one thing that I heard when I joined, I believe it was the April meeting, town council meeting, or a meeting this spring, there was a lot of concern expressed about health impacts if the soil was disturbed. And so I think that is also one of the reasons why the town council has voted to leave all of the waste in place, which I understand that concern, but I think that with the stability and the health impacts, it's worth it to go ahead and get a company that can remove it.
And let me just jump in real quick on that point. I know we want to keep moving with our agenda, but you're absolutely right that the town, some of the folks speaking for the town, have raised concerns about cleaning up coal ash being unsafe. And while you could do it in an unsafe way, there are lots of protective regulations and standards about how to do it. And I do want to note, since this has been my work for the last 11 years, millions of tons of coal ash are being cleaned up throughout North Carolina and the Southeast safely, and being put into much safer, dry line storage away from waterways, and that's being done successfully. So I do think it's something that the town has raised, I think, to try to say it would be, a bad thing to address what's going on at this site. But really, I think the only question should really be what needs to be done at this site. And then again, we're not advocating for a complete excavation of this entire site. We do think there's some areas of ash that definitely need to be removed, and the town needs to do more to remove ash than it is currently proposing to do. But when that's being done, is that is a good thing. That is going to make this whole situation safer.
Thank you. And I think I'm going to move us forward, but I am taking down all the questions that we've not gone back to yet. So they will be answered eventually. So next we have Caroline Armijo, who's a founding member of Act Against Coal Ash and founder and director of the Lilies Project. And before we hear from her, we will queue up a video, At What Cost, which delves into the toxic legacies of coal ash. So let me get that queued up.
My name is Annie Brown. I'm a lifelong resident of Stokes County. I've lived in this area since 1950. And I started getting sick when I was 22. And I love to turn the switch on and have my lights just like anybody else. But at what cost? You know, if I had known that that stuff was toxic, I wouldn't be living where I'm living now.
In 2005, I moved to Washington, D.C., and around 2010, I started to notice that a lot of people back home in Stokes County were really sick and dying of cancer. My mom's cousin had this mysterious leukemia. She died within 2 weeks. Danielle had been diagnosed with a brain tumor, and I knew she didn't smoke or didn't drink, and I just thought that was really strange that someone my age, so young, would have cancer.
My name's Danielle Bailey Lash. When I was 35 years old, I was diagnosed with stage 3 brain cancer, and that was in 2010. I've lived in Walnut Cove in the Stokes County area near Pine Hall Road for 20 some years at least. Never expecting to become sick at age 35 and given a expiration date of 3 to 4 months. But now I'm in remission, but the unfortunate thing is, even though I've put that behind me, I'm starting to make a connection. Something is not right.
I do not feel that the state is properly keeping tabs on it, the contamination that we're receiving here in the water tables and also in some of the ash pits that we have in the local area. Possibility of the coal ash getting into the dam river is a possibility too, contaminating the fish and also the river. It's very close. I mean, it's within 100 feet.
I'm Dr. Deborah Cowan. I'm a veterinarian here in Stokes County. We have lived here since 1993. One of the things we have noticed over the years is back in the early 90s when we first came here, we used to see a lot of Canada geese landing on the pond. And some days you could go out there, there'd be, I don't know, 30, 50, 100. And as time has progressed, you see none.
I'm concerned about wildlife. I love wildlife. But I love human life as well. And I have children, I have grandchildren, and I even have great-grandchildren. I'm a young great-grandmother, and I want them to be able to have a life that's free of constant problems that's caused by toxins, you know. I'm concerned about them.
Okay. Okay, are y'all ready? Thank you for sharing that. I'm Carolyn Armijo, and we filmed that At What Cost video with Appalachian Voices in 2014. It was about 2 months after the Dan River spill, and that 6 months later in September, we lost Annie. And so we've also lost Danielle, and I'm sorry to be emotional about this, but I think that it's really hard on our communities to have so much loss. And I have worked statewide around this issue, and it's just a consistent problem is to have different people being impacted by coal ash and just seeing all the ways. It's not just cancer. In the Blues Creek community, we've had a lot of miscarriages. One woman had 11 miscarriages, another had 5. We've had deformities where children have not survived the loss. We have a lot of asthma children who have to be homeschooled because they can't breathe and go to school and, consistently. We've had a lot of people around my age that I believe were playing in coal ash that never were able to learn how to read. And so there's just a lot of things that we don't identify or talk about, because often we focus on the cancers, which is a huge problem in and of itself, but it's just like there's so many health concerns. Adam spoke about the panel at Duke that we both participated in, and a doctor talked for 30 minutes of all of the health impacts, including like children that are unable to control their bladder. That is a direct symptom of coal ash. So we're obviously not going to cover all those issues, but I just want to reiterate my concern around Lake Norman High School. Nick showed where the earth was opened up in 2018 after a rain event. And I am in close contact with Susan Farrell-Wind, who has been a lead organizer at that school. I just texted her since we've been on this call, and she said that 23 children in the school have had cancer. 4 to 5 have passed away. And so the issue, she was organized for years before the ash was exposed. So it's not really about when we're going to see the ash, it's just being in that close proximity. And I'm not a scientist, I am a mother and an advocate and an artist. And so it's not, we've had a lot of emails about this over the last several months. And one person said, well, the concern really is if you track it in the building and then people breathe it in. Well, that's not really the concern. We don't really know how it gets in our bodies, or we would have already have like a major fund from our utilities, because we would be able to sue them and successfully win, but that hasn't happened yet. So recently, just last week, a week ago today, I was part of a panel at Flyleaf Books. There's a new book, Under the Skin, by Linda Villarosa. She writes about all of the just basically how racism impacts the health of Black Americans. And my friendship with Danielle is featured in chapter 5. And right before that event, a reporter from WFDD called to play a quote from Danielle. And she was talking about how she just didn't want anyone to suffer one day what she went through. And so I just think that, yes, it's a great property to develop. It is, housing is a need. It is on, a major traffic corridor. I lived in Chapel Hill for 13 years. I lived on Hilltop. So I was probably 50 feet from the coal ash for about a 9-month period. And we still have an apartment in Chapel Hill and Winchester Courts. I am a current taxpayer and have been for the last 20 years. So I just really urge the town to look at different quotes. as part of my advocacy with trying to get Duke Energy to clean up the coal ash, I would always cite to South Carolina. They were able to clean up a lot faster and cheaper than the original proposals. And so I believe that the town has only received one quote at this point. And I believe, it's standard practice for government projects to have 3 quotes. And since they've already learned that it is cheaper, I really think that that is the way that the town should go, and just go ahead and remove the ash. And as a parent, to see the debris that's there with Adam's pictures, it reminds me of those bombed out lots in London from the 40s and the children playing in it. I could just see the kids down there in that. So I really would like to just encourage the town to do what is right. I don't think it's a good idea to just leave it there and take the chance. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much, especially for sharing, a really vulnerable personal story for you and your community. I think someone asked in the chat, it was from Peter, to your point, what sources of funding are available for removal of coal ash? And are the university or Duke Energy liable or on the hook for the cost of making the site safe? So whoever feels confident in answering that.
No one else will.
Well,
I'll start off. Dick, up here. Nick, you go ahead. We start at the same time. So.
Well, it's all good. All I was going to say was, unfortunately, the current situation is that there's not a legal hook that we're aware of that would be sort of available today, where the town could seek cleanup costs from UNC as the generator of the ash. This was done at a time when there weren't really any regulations around coal ash disposal, and so basically that's the problem. But if the town could pursue that, they could talk to UNC, they could see what they could work out. There may be other sources of funding available, they could pursue those. We're not aware that they have pursued those. So I guess that's what I would say.
Yeah, and I can just add, I've heard, again, I've been doing this job for 6 months, but I've heard that that UNC has been approached a little, initially, I think when this was found, but so far that they have not been interested in cleaning it up. There are other toxic sites that they have cleaned up from their waste, but this is not one that they've worked. But I do think it's worth pursuing those talks if we move forward with this.
I think this might be a follow-up question from Elizabeth, just put in the chat. What about federal grants to clean up?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think this site is in the realm of contaminated sites. This is small. It's not, it's not close to the worst kind of contaminated sites that are out there. And so, it's not a Superfund site. It's not anything like that. There may be grant funding that could be available. Like I said, that's something the town would need to investigate to see what they might be able to do. But I think it is a tough situation for them. But there are some basic steps that they could take to address the pollution concerns, starting with not revisiting the idea of if you're going to build something on this site, doing commercial or office as opposed to residential, removing more of the eroding areas of ash and the areas that have health risk associated with them, using most protective standards, and doing the long-term monitoring, that I think would be very doable. But again, that's something they need to affirmatively sort of start pursuing.
Yeah, and can I, Amelia, can I respond to that? So I think in that right now, the town, my fellow council members feel that the town has a plan, and that they've paid several $100,000s of your tax money to various consultants who have given them the answer, or have given us the answer that we were looking for, which was if you pour some dirt over it and put a retaining wall up, it's safe enough to put housing on it. So I think once people get very invested in a solution like that, and money has been spent, that then politically it becomes harder to move unless people really raise the alarm and get worried about this. And I think what I've seen politically is that while this site was not under discussion for immediately being developed, while there was not a housing proposal with an apartment and a big pond and places for kids to play in the dirt over all those pictures I showed you, people were not as concerned about that. But now that there are these plans, I think people are much more concerned. So I think maybe some of these other solutions that people are asking about, could we get some sort of federal grants? It might mean that we can't develop all of the site, if we did that. But that's the kind of thing that, I think politically we sort of have to turn the cruise ships. It's like doing a cruise ship doing a three-point turn in the ocean. That's going to take a little bit of time and a lot of pushing from all of us to make that happen, and from all of you, really. You've pushed me already, but I'm only one out of 8. So.
I see we've had a few questions in the chat, both from Susan, and Lib, about how the US EPA could weigh in on this, the Environmental Protection Agency.
Hey, this is Nick. The short answer is I don't think that's going to happen. I mean, again, this is not a Superfund site. This is not the kind of coal ash site that is subject to federal coal ash rules. This is treated as a local, originally it was called an inactive hazardous waste site, and now it's under the state brownfields program, and it's being handled through those state programs. And there's not, I don't see a EPA playing a role in this going forward. Which means that, the key decision makers are the town in terms of what it's going to propose to the state, and then the folks in the state brownfields office who are going to decide what to do about that proposal, and whether it is sufficiently protective or not. And those are the folks who will be making the decisions about this site in the coming months.
And I think I will use that to transition to our next speaker, the need for strong risk management, that will be addressed by Robert Beasley. And Robert is a Chapel Hill resident who lives near Bolin Creek and works in IT risk management.
Hi there. Thank you. Let me start by saying I became aware of the 828 MLK property situation just about a year ago. I was attending a town council meeting for another topic, and they started to talk about the risk management assessment that they would do over the course of last summer. And in that discussion, I heard some things that raised my concerns, and I spoke on that meeting, and I've been following it ever since. As Amelia said, I work with risk management, but it's in IT. It's not exactly the same as environmental risk management. So I'm not a brownfields expert. I'm not a chemist. I don't do any of that. But there are similarities with the fundamentals of risk management, and that's what I'm going to talk to you about, and talk about the concerns that I've got in that context. Let me try and share this presentation. All right. So can you see that screen? I can't tell if it's cutting off or not.
It's cutting off a little bit for me.
Let me see if I can do it another way. My apologies. All right, well, I'll just try and do it in slideshow mode. All right, so risk mitigation. One of the fundamental things that you deal with in risk mitigation is the understanding that as long as the threat remains, there's risk. In the case of the 828 MLK site, the threat are these coal combustible products, the CCPs. And if you read the studies on the town's website, they talk about the CCPs, and those are the things like arsenic and lead and all of the hazardous compounds and chemicals and metals that are products of burning coal ash and residual coal ash. So that's the threat. And the risks are contamination of the environment and hazardous exposure to humans and to animals. So, the risk of a threat can be mitigated and managed, right? And we talked earlier about that. I think Nick's presentation talked about it. The approach that the town and I think the Brownfields Agreement proposal talks about is this cap and containment controls, right? So they're gonna cap it and contain the coal ash, and that is their way of mitigating the risk of hazardous exposure and contamination of the environment from the threat of the coal combustible products. But given the risk is there as long as the threat is there, we have to recognize that whatever controls you put in place, they have to be maintained indefinitely, right? Because as long as the threat remains, there's risk. And in that town council meeting where they were talking about the risk assessment, one of the concerns that I raised was whatever controls you put in place, you're going to have to make sure that the funding is there to keep them up. Because if those controls aren't maintained, well, the risk isn't being mitigated and bad things happen. And when you look at, the town of Chapel Hill or any entity, whether it be business or a municipality, they're always making decisions about, well, what do we fund? What do we spend the budget on? And infrastructure investments often get delayed, right? We can't pave the roads this year. We want to spend the money on something else. Let's pave them next year. And the mitigation controls for the 828 MLK site, we have to recognize that they're going to come under those same pressures, and they aren't things that you want to say, oh well, let's just not add the cover. If they go with dirt cover, for example, this year we'll do it next year, or maybe we'll do it 5 years from now, or you have to always do it because the risk is high if you don't. So that's the key message. As long as the threat is there, there's risk. So what can go wrong? Well, I just mentioned one of them, right? They have to be maintained indefinitely. So you've got to maintain the mitigation controls. One of the mitigation controls is this containment wall that they're proposing be built along the Bolin Creek Trail to keep the CCPs up out of the trail and off of out of the creek. That's going to require maintenance. Time erodes everything, right? Cracks in the wall, unforeseen events that will degrade it. It's got to be maintained indefinitely. The capping cover, right? If it's dirt erodes. It wears down over time. Landscaping, if you don't sod the grass and fertilize it and keep it up, it deteriorates. The soil erodes faster. It's got to be maintained, and you have to monitor it to make sure that it's being maintained. Storm comes, did that damage the wall? Storm comes, did it wash away some of the dirt? Other events can happen. Person was out walking their dog. The dog started to dig. They didn't know that they're digging over coal ash is a dirt displace. Things happen. You have to monitor whatever mitigation controls are in place to make sure that they're being maintained, because as soon as they start to deprecate, you've got to take action. You've got to repair them, strengthen them. Otherwise, the risk increases. Another concern is, the property owner is held responsible. Well, the property owner changes. DEQ, the Brownfields agreement, they talk about, well, the responsibilities transfer property owner to property owner. They're held accountable, responsible indefinitely. But, every time there's a change of ownership, there's a chance that the new owner may not understand or may not fulfill the obligations as well as the previous owner. And yes, we've got the government agency that's providing oversight for that. And, I think many of the town council members take some confidence that the oversight will ensure that a property owner will be held responsible and the maintenance of the mitigation controls will happen. But we see that that's not always the case, right? Oversight fails, bureaucracy makes things take longer. And if these mitigation controls start to decay, the risk goes back up again, right? And bad things happen. So those are things that can go wrong. Just talking about the timeline and the span of time. There was discussion earlier about, well, this was discovered in 2013, or first gets noticed or documented by the town in 2013. And there's an official assessment on the town website for this that you can go and read, where they document finding the fly ash. And that was 9 years ago. And that feels like a long time, 9 years, right? In 2020, that was when the town implemented what they call their interim remedial measures. And this was being done, it appears, in coordination with improvements that were made to the the Greenway Trail along Bolin Creek. The DEQ advised them that conditions were unsafe. They needed to take some action. So they implement these interim remedial measures in 2020. And now we're in 2022. They've entered into the agreement with Belmont Sayre, and from the information that's been shared, 2024 is when the demolition of the existing site improvements, which probably means the police station, starts to happen, and it moves under the brownfields program. So for 4 years, right, 2020 when the interim remedial measures are implemented, to 2024, those interim remedial measures have to be maintained. And DEQ already has some level of oversight. It's not the brownfields oversight, but some level of oversight. If you read the interim remedial measures report, you'll see them talk about, these things need to be maintained. They've got some specific examples. But as you saw from the pictures that Councilmember Searing shared earlier, they're already starting to fail, right? Some of the remedial measures were adding fill and grading to cover the coal ash and do some hydro seeding to promote grass growth. And they actually talk about, you're going to have to fertilize this every year. You're going to have to maintain this mitigation control to keep the coal ash in place. And they need to do that for 4 years until it's under the brownfields program and they've got whatever the permanent measures are. And we can already see that's not really happening. Before I move on, the other thing to point out on this slide is the testing, right? A lot of the monitoring that, from what I've heard the town talk about and the DEQ with the brownfields program, it's all visual. And you can see there isn't any testing that's been done since the remedial measures. I think in the report they actually talk about some testing that was done right after the measures were completed. Just to validate that the measures were in place and things were safe. But that was really at the time they were done. There hasn't been anything since then, and that was only 2 years ago, maybe not even 2 years ago. And so it's important that we monitor with actual testing, not just visual. So, I'm talking a little bit about this, why worry on the last chart, right? The mitigation controls, if they're not adequately maintained, the risk is increased, right? It's not being mitigated. And like I said, this is the quote from that IRM report that talks about what needs to be done, right? They said you've got to fertilize, you've got to check the silt fence and the chain link fence that's intended to keep the CCPs from moving off the site down onto the trail, providing a hazard to folks on the trail and to Bolin Creek. These have to be kept up. And you look at photos from Mr. Searing's presentation, and it's pretty obvious that's not happening. So, if it doesn't happen now with these IRMs for, just this 2 years that have passed, we need to be worried that it's not going to happen after the brownfields agreement is in place. That needs to be a concern. I talked about the visual inspection, right? That's subjective monitoring. We need objective monitoring, right? The visual inspection, maybe somebody looks at it, does that look like coal ash to you? Does that look like too much coal ash to you? It's kind of like when you go to get your car inspected, right? That's a risk management program. The state says, hey, you got to have windshield wipers on your car and they got to work for it to pass inspection. Well, some of the inspectors might look at your windshield wipers and say, they're good enough. And other inspectors might look at your windshield wipers and say, they're not good enough. You need to replace them. It's subjective. And we can't just rely on subjective monitoring with this coal ash and the CCPs. And again, another thing to worry about is the regulatory oversight. Now, like I said, the regulatory oversight under the brownfields agreement, it sounds like it's more than what the DEQ is doing today, but I don't think that we should be in a mindset of, oh, well, the DEQ is going to look over it and make sure it happens, so everything will be fine. Because we can look and see cases where regulatory oversight doesn't appear to work. Things still go wrong. It wasn't too long ago, I think in the last 2 months, this Bellevue Mills brownfield site in Hillsborough, North Carolina, popped up in the news. Now it's not coal ash, right? It's not exactly the same, but it's under a brownfields agreement. And the articles talk about how, well, it changed owners a few times, and the new owners, well, they stopped filing their reports with the DEQ. I think it was back in 2018. Some of the residents have said that, well, mold has started to develop in the site, and they tie it back to it being, a brownfield site. And now they're looking at a class action suit, and the DEQ says, well, we looked at it, we notified folks, and they're filing the paperwork now, but it's just not, there's no guarantee that regulatory oversight is going to absolutely prevent the mitigation controls from failing and the risk rising, and the threat is still there, and bad things happen, right? So that's why we need to worry. So, I lost my screen share. So I've got one more slide, and then I'll wrap up. So going forward responsibly. So we've got to recognize and remember that as long as these coal combustible products exist on the site, there's risk. Some of the statements I've heard made in the discussion with the town about the brownfields agreement is, oh, we're gonna put these controls in place, we're gonna cover the site, there's not gonna be any risk, right? We'll take the risk to zero. And that just isn't logical. As long as the threat is there, there's risk. The mitigation controls can reduce the risk, and as long as they're maintained, the risk is lower. But the risk is always there, always there. And these controls are going to require an ongoing investment, and they're going to require monitoring, and the regulators and the owners, the organizations that are going to be responsible for maintaining the controls, for providing the oversight, they face multiple priorities. The system can break down. People are human, and mistakes will be made. And in risk management, you have to recognize that. You have to plan for when things go wrong. As long as the threat is there, how are you going to manage the risk? How are you going to, as early as possible, detect that things are going wrong so you can take corrective action? So we can't assume the brownfields program itself is sufficient. We need to safely remove as much of the CCP threat as possible, right? There's a lot of discussion about, well, is it, can we remove it all safely? I don't know, I'm not a scientist. I'm sure, though, that we can remove much of it safely. We need to remove as much of it safely as possible, because as long as it is there, there's risk. It is the threat. If we can't remove it all, we've got to have repeatable and objective testing of whatever mitigation controls get put into place. And the testing has to be sufficient for us to detect very early on when the controls are starting to fail and degrade. And they will. You just have to recognize that they will. So how do you detect early when it's happening so that you can proactively respond to the failures before the threat, the risk from the threat materializes, which is hazardous contamination, affecting public health, contaminating the environment, all the stuff I mentioned early on. So that's what I wanted to share with you tonight. I hope that made sense. Amelia, if you want, I'll take some questions.
Yeah, this was actually directed towards Nick, but I think it kind of plays off of the risk management information that you've shared from Amanda, asking if the Southern Environmental Law Center has a specific recommendation for cleanup. So coal ash is mentioned, they mentioned that coal ash is not sitting in groundwater, but that a certain amount needs to be removed. Can you talk a little bit more about how this site can become more protected? How should the surface be covered, for example?
Okay, so Amelia, you want me to speak to that?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So I'm gonna real quick share my screen again. There we go. Okay. So I did want to touch on this briefly. So I'm glad somebody asked about it. And people have different views on this. What I would say is, I think there's some things that, based on our experience with other kinds of coal ash sites that have other kinds of problems and threats that aren't present at this site, this is not something where we feel like, based on our experience at coal ash lagoons that are, giant utility and coal ash lagoons, where there's really a full excavation is the only option. Here, based on the studies that have been done, we feel like there is more middle ground between what the town is proposing now, which is, I'd say very little at the moment in terms of protections, and a full excavation on the other hand. And so, in particular, I think in terms of what should the town do, I would say there's three things that seem pretty clear to me, and we've presented these to the town repeatedly and raised them at every opportunity. So I'll raise them again. And they are these. We think they should, again, this plan to put the residential housing on the coal ash site is something that's never been done successfully to our knowledge. We've asked the town for examples that they have, or their developer for examples that they have of where that's been done successfully. And they didn't have any. The example they gave us was a site in Michigan, which was a brownfields project that had a lot of coal ash on the site. And it was in fact redeveloped for residential use in addition to other uses. But when we actually looked it up and dug into the example that they provided, it turned out that actually the developer in that situation had removed all of the coal ash from the residential areas, which I think just illustrates the importance of not going forward with the current concept that they're proposing now at this site in Chapel Hill. Second issue is removing problem areas of coal ash. And so this is, I think, what the question was most specifically directed to. There is, as I mentioned, that steep slope of ash where Adam's photographs are from. It's right above the public greenway. It's where the erosion is happening most conspicuously. It's where a good amount of the ash is located, and where it's located close to the surface, and where they have found high levels of contamination. And it's relatively accessible. They actually cut down all the trees from part of that area and already, and so there would be that's something that could be done. So we think removing that area, that steep slope area of coal ash, where it's the most problematic, rather than trying to contain it with a retaining wall and the dirt cover that's subject to erosion, groundwater migration, stability concerns, et cetera, would be an obvious way to address sort of the most concerning area of the site, where those pictures were taken and where much of the contamination is located. So that is sort of the low-hanging fruit, and it's right along the edge of the floodplain of Bolin Creek, and I mentioned that at the beginning. So with hurricanes and increasing storm events and flooding, all the concerns about stability and ash migrating are going to continue to be significant risks at that area. So removing it to me makes sense. The other issue is there are areas in the upland portion of the site, the uphill portion of the site, where the town has done a risk assessment and found unacceptable risk levels now. And of course, they say, well, that won't be the situation in the future because we're going to put buildings and a layer of dirt on top. But again, that ash and those risks are there, covered with dirt. And if they get exposed, that's a problem. So one thing the town has said is we will remove some amount of ash. That was in the slide I showed you from their law firm earlier. They haven't specified what ash or where. We think that what makes the most sense is to use the most protective health standards to identify the areas of ash or contaminated soil that are above those, the most protective threshold, and say, well, remove those areas. Unfortunately, what the town has done so far in their risk assessment is to use a health risk standard that is 100 times less protective than the most protective standard that could be used. There's a range from an increased cancer risk of 1 in 10,000, which is the least protective. It's used, it's a standard number that is used, but you can also use, and it is also standard to use, more protective standards going up to a 1 in 1 million cancer risk. And that is the most protective standard that's used in these kinds of situations. And we think that is the standard that makes sense for this site right here in Chapel Hill, right above the public greenway, particularly if there's going to be any kind of public access on the site. So using that most protective standard to identify the problem areas and remove them would be the approach that we think makes sense here, given that there are very significant problems at this site, but it's also different from a Duke Energy coal ash lagoon. So that's what I would say about that. The last point on this slide has already been spoken to, and that's the need to sample soil and water, both groundwater and Bolin Creek, in perpetuity, because again, you want to catch problems going forward, and that you're not going to be able to do that unless you are actually measuring what's happening at the site. I will stop sharing.
Thank you, Nick. That was very thorough. And we're continuing to receive questions. Some folks are asking also about what they can do, a call to action. So I want to just move us forward and we can go back to follow up with questions after Jason speaks. So Jason Torian is a community organizer with the Blue Ridge Environmental Defense League. And he is also a former public school teacher. He's a longtime community activist and Democratic political strategist in Person County, and also serves as a member of the Person County Board of Education.
All right, thanks, Amelia. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I have a short presentation. Let's see. All right, so my name is Jason Torian, and I'm with the Blue Ridge Environmental Defense League. I don't live in Orange County. I became involved with this issue through my work with CHOCE, which is a local group that is fighting to get UNC to close its coal-fired power plant. And I think that's an important distinction to make, because it seems that some folks, even some folks on the council, have characterized opposition to this proposal as a no affordable housing in my backyard situation, when that's not the case at all. Those of us who oppose this project are doing so because of concerns for the environment and concerns for the health of those who live around and potentially own that site. And if that wasn't the case, folks like myself, folks like Amelia, and folks like Caroline, who they also don't live in Chapel Hill, wouldn't be a part of this session tonight. So just wanted to make that clear. When you mention this proposed development to anyone with even a passing knowledge of coal ash, or the Kingston, Tennessee disaster, or the unexplained cancer clusters in communities like Huntersville and Mooresville, they're stunned that something like this would be even considered in a progressive town like Chapel Hill. And make no mistake about it, it will happen if we don't stand up and do something about it. So just to expand on that point, as you heard earlier, in March, the town council voted 8-1 to move forward with this memorandum of understanding with regards to redevelopment of 828 MLK. And since that time, there have been no signs of turning back. But the one thing that I think is promising and makes me feel hopeful about the situation is that the project is still in its very early stages. And you can see on this slide right here, these are the council people who voted for, including the mayor has showed that she's in favor of it as well. And Councilman Syrian, who's with us tonight, voted against. But again, the thing that makes me hopeful is that that was only a memorandum of understanding, which was just one of the first steps. That's a non-binding agreement. It allows the town to participate in further discussion about redeveloping the site, and allows the town to complete a site plan, which DEQ needs in order to know what type of mitigation needs to take place. So nothing's set in stone by any means. So now is the time for you to make your voice heard and let the town council know that you don't want this to happen. So as you heard, I'm a former school teacher, so we're gonna have a little bit of homework and a little bit of classwork to do tonight. So what I want you to do is I'm gonna share a slide, and if you could either follow that link or use this QR code on the screen, it's going to send you to a page where you can sign up to be a part of our email list, or help plan a rally, or just join another group that's fighting coal ash in some way. And then there's also a section for other comments. So if you could do that, if you have a moment to do that right now, I'll put that QR code back up on the screen. I'll give you a second if you're interested in doing that. And then we'll go over the resource sheet a little bit together. All right, so after you have signed up, I'll go to sharing my screen again. We'll take a moment to look at the resource sheet. And we'll also be sharing this email through a PDF through email at the end of this session. But right now, let's look a little more closely at it. On the front side, you'll see we have included phone numbers and email addresses for town council members and Department of Environmental Quality officials who have a say in the decision. So you've gotten your classwork, and now you can get your homework. So I'm asking that if this is something that you don't want to see happen in Chapel Hill, sometime between now and this weekend, take a moment to contact someone from the list on the left, whether it's Ms. Beiser, Mr. Watkins, Mr. Nichols, Ms. Eckerd, or even Mr. Bellamy, who works in Governor Cooper's office as a policy advisor. Email them or call them and let them know how you feel about this project. Let them know you're concerned about the risks and the unknowns that you've heard about here tonight. So if you could do that between now and Saturday, that would be great. On the back side of the sheet, we've also included contact information for groups who are currently working on coal ash issues. Some of the groups are local, some of them are statewide, some of them are regional, but all have the same goal in mind of ensuring that the public isn't negatively impacted by the production of coal power. We also have some information up here that, some you may have heard tonight, some you might not be aware of, such as the fact that this would be the first site in the US where we knowingly are building housing on top of an old coal ash dump, not just using it as cover, but building it on an actual coal ash dump. The fact that the coal ash has been exposed for nearly 40 years. And there are photos here that were in Adam's slideshow. I included those on the resource sheet as well. And then we'll get to this bottom point in just a moment about the health data of the police officers. There isn't any right now. So you have power and influence in the situation, and I would strongly encourage you to fight with your voice. And how can you do that? You can talk to your friends and neighbors. I mean, most people don't know about a lot of the things that we discussed here tonight during the meeting. There are a lot of unknowns. What's the debris? What sort of debris is in the pile? What does that contain? I mean, there were questions like that were asked in the chat tonight. How much asbestos is in there in addition to the coal ash? Will that stuff rise to the surface? There are lots of unanswered questions in that respect. What about the health of the police officers who worked there for 40 years? In some council meetings, that's been brought up that, those of us who are opposing housing there, aren't worried about the health of the police officers. Well, according to the information that I received last night, they don't have that information on the health of the police officers. So that's a concern. That's an unknown. And, even the developer has acknowledged that there is a certain level of risk, just as Robert said in his presentation. There is a certain level of risk involved with this project. So use your voice, let your friends and neighbors know that, call the town council, call and email DEQ officials, sign up for that email list, or join a group that's already working on the issue. And, if that isn't effective or you feel like you're not getting the results that you want, remember those town council members are elected officials. And 2023 is right around the corner. So use your vote wisely. Make sure that you're keenly aware of where they and other candidates for council stand on environmental issues going forward. So use your voice. Protesting, writing letters isn't the only way that you have an impact in that process. You have other ways to influence the council as well. So we all appreciate the need for additional housing in Chapel Hill. We get that. There are folks on this call tonight, including SELC, who have advocated for that for years. The question is, at what cost? What are we willing to sacrifice? How much of a risk are we willing to take? Are we willing to sacrifice the health of our neighbors? I mean, I don't think the folks on this call are. So let's encourage the town council to find a way to use this site that doesn't jeopardize the health of Chapel Hill residents. In its current state, housing isn't the way to do that. And we've heard, different groups speak about different potential options for, remediating this site. In the chat, we've heard other options for remediating the site. We're not here to endorse one particular way of doing that. But what all of these groups, all this coalition that came together tonight, what we all agree on is that in its current state, housing shouldn't be placed at that site. So if you feel that way, tonight is the time to get involved. Like I said, use those email addresses, join some of these groups that are already active and start having your voice heard by the council and by DEQ.
Thank you, Jason. I know someone else, I think you pretty clearly shared the specific actions that you recommend attendees take, but someone else in the chat asked, what are some facts that we can share with others? So I don't know if there's other speakers who have certain facts or certain points that they think are really salient that we share with others, whether it's our neighbors or town council members or the NC Department of Environmental Quality.
I think a key fact is that the town implemented the interim remedial measures in 2020. The interim remedial measures report included, it's hard to say whether they're recommendations or requirements, but it included instructions for how those measures had to be maintained to maintain the risk mitigation and safety levels. And all one has to do is look at the pictures from Mr. Searing, the news story from WRAL, to see that those measures weren't being maintained. And that's with a town government that cares about the coal ash, wants to protect its citizens, accepted the responsibility, and yet it still failed. I think that's a very important fact as we go into this brownfields agreement.
Yeah, anyone else have any comments on that?
Well, I would say, again, one thing that's really alarming to me is the fact that, we've had town officials working on this site for 40 years. And according to, information that I've received from the town, there really isn't any information on their health at this point. And given the questions related to the site, I would think that would be something that should be top of mind, considering we have a group of people who have already worked on the site that was covered at the time. What's their health like? So for me, that's an important thing to think about.
Sorry, my dog is in the background playing with a toy, but I saw that Linda put in the chat, emailing a list of facts to all that participated that we can share. Most people are not going to read long reports. I think that's very true. And we're also looking into hosting a part 2 of this event where we get to do more of a deep dive into the importance of public comments and how to write an effective public comment. So hopefully some folks can join us for that and we can share additional resources. Trying to see if there are any other final questions before we close it off tonight. Yeah, I think for the sake of time and maybe to give you all 10 minutes back of your night, we'll save the chat. So we'll be able to, pick up if there's a question that went unanswered and hopefully answer that in a follow-up email or via another means. So we will be in touch with you all very soon. Thanks everyone for joining.
I think Adam might have wanted to say something.
Oh yeah.
I
didn't know
don't
if you're
want to
waving
keep us
by or
up.
just saying hi.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to thank you, Amelia and Jason, and all the other organizers for doing such an amazing job. we would not be having this discussion at the town and slowing this down if it wasn't for you all and all the people like Robert and Nancy and everyone else who's been organizing this. It's just amazing effort. I so much appreciate it as a parent and a person in Chapel Hill, a parent and a town council member. So thank you very, very much. And thank it to everybody who came as well. Right. Are we done? Is that?
I think that's it, unless anyone has any
All right.
last remarks.